Hello, and welcome to Lanternlight Chronicles. Tonight, let the world grow small and warm around you. Let the day you have lived settle quietly behind you, and let it go. Loosen your shoulders. Let your hands fall open. Let your breathing slow and deepen, and find its own unhurried rhythm. And let me carry you a very long way from here, more than 1,000 years into the past. North across the gray seas, to a cold and beautiful country of dark water and pale winter light, where the nights are very long and the wind comes off the sea with snow in it, and where, in a low building of turf and timber standing alone above a fjord, a fire is burning, and a family is gathered around it, waiting out the winter, as their people have waited it out for 1,000 years. Picture it now. It is deep winter, and it is dark, and it has been dark since the middle of the afternoon. Outside, the wind moves over the roof, and the snow drifts against the walls, and somewhere below, the black water of the fjord laps against a shore of round stones. But you are not outside. You are within. And the door is shut, and the world has shrunk to this one long room, and it is warm. Look around you. The building is long and narrow, longer than it is wide by many times, with a roof that curves gently like the hull of an upturned ship. The walls are thick, so thick you could not put your arms around them, built of stacked turf and stone packed with earth, and they hold the warmth in the way the earth itself holds warmth. Great curved timbers rise from the floor in 2 rows to hold the roof, and the roof itself is turf and birch bark laid over rafters, and in summer grass and even small flowers grow upon it. There are no windows. The only light is the fire. And the fire runs down the center of the room in a long stone-lined hearth, a line of low flames and glowing embers stretching away into the dimness. And along both sides of it, raised a little above the floor, run the wide earthen benches on which this family sits and works, and eats and sleeps. The smoke drifts up, and gathers under the high roof, and finds its slow way out through the vent above, and the air near the ceiling is a dark haze. And everything, the timbers, the wool hangings, the very smell of the place, is soaked with the sweetness of wood smoke. Iron lamps of fish oil burn here and there with small flames. Somewhere back in the shadows a cow shifts and breathes in the byre at the end of the building, for the animals are indoors too, and their warmth is part of the warmth of the house. And the people. A woman sits at an upright loom against the wall, working by firelight. The loom waits clicking softly as she passes the weft. An old man is carving something small out of antler, turning it in his fingers close to the flames. 2 children lie along a bench under a sheepskin, half asleep, listening. Somebody is stirring a pot hanging on a chain over the fire. And somebody else is telling a story, unhurried, in a low voice. The way people tell stories when there is a whole winter to fill and nowhere at all to go. This is a longhouse, in the age we call the Viking Age, and tonight we are going to stay in it. For here is the thing about the Vikings. Almost everything most of us picture when we hear that word is either wrong, or is only a very small corner of the truth. We picture horned helmets, which they never wore. We picture nothing but raiding and burning and blood. We picture wild, filthy barbarians howling out of the north. And behind all of that noise stands the reality, which is quieter and stranger and far more interesting, that the overwhelming majority of these people were farmers. They kept cows and sheep. They cut hay. They fished. They wove cloth. They raised children, argued about property, told jokes, made law, combed their hair, and spent long dark winters sitting close together around a fire in a house like this one. So tonight, we are not going to follow a fleet of raiders. Tonight we are going to ask what life was really like inside these houses. We will learn how the longhouse was built, and why it was built that way. We will meet the household, the family, and the servants, and the enslaved, and see how the work was divided, and who really held the power. We will eat their food and drink their ale. We will follow their year, from the frantic light of summer to the deep dark of winter. We will look at their gods and their laws, their feuds and their poetry, their games and their ships, and the long nights of storytelling out of which came some of the greatest literature of the medieval world. And we will do it slowly and quietly, sitting by the fire, while the wind moves over the roof. There is nothing you need to remember tonight. There will be no test in the morning, and nothing here you must carry with you into sleep. If your thoughts begin to drift and wander, let them drift. If sleep comes to gather you up before we reach the end, then let it come, and welcome. For that is exactly what this quiet hour is for. The fire will still be burning in the dark, and I will still be here, telling the long story softly, whether you hear the end of it tonight or not. And if you find that these calm histories help to carry you down toward rest, you might gently tap the like button, and perhaps subscribe, so that more of them can find their way to you and to others who lie awake in the dark, and are looking for something quiet to hold on to. That is the only thing I will ask of you all evening. And now, let the modern world dissolve entirely, and let us settle back on the bench, and let the fire burn low, and let us go north, 1,000 years, into the long winter night. Let us begin by setting the scene properly, by placing these people in their world and their time. For the word Viking carries a great deal of confusion with it, and it is worth clearing some of that away before we go further. The age we are speaking of runs from roughly the end of the 8th century to the middle of the 11th, some 250 or 300 years. And the homeland of these people was Scandinavia, the lands we now call Norway, Denmark and Sweden, together with the islands and coasts around them, and, in time, the new settlements they made in Iceland and Greenland and the Faroes and Orkney and Shetland and beyond. And the word itself did not mean what we now take it to mean. To go Viking in the old language was to go on a voyage, usually a raiding or trading voyage overseas. It was something a person did, for a season or two, not something a person was. It was an activity, like going fishing or going to market, and most people in these societies never did it at all. The great majority of the population lived and died within a few miles of the farm where they were born, and never raided anyone, and never saw a foreign shore. When we call the whole civilization the Vikings, we are naming an entire people after the summer occupation of a minority of its young men, which is rather as though the whole of some later nation were named after its sailors. So who were they then? They were the farming peoples of the north, heirs to a way of life that had been developing in Scandinavia for thousands of years, speaking a common language, worshipping a common set of gods, sharing a common law and custom and poetry, and divided into a great number of small territories under chieftains and petty kings, who quarreled with one another endlessly, and who slowly, over the course of the age, coalesced into the kingdoms we know today. The land they lived in shaped everything about them. Norway is a country of mountains falling into the sea, cut everywhere by long, narrow fjords, with very little flat ground, so that farms cling to whatever strip of workable land can be found between the water and the rock, often isolated from their neighbors by ridges and inlets, reachable most easily by boat. Sweden has broad forests and lakes, and better farmland in the south. Denmark is low and gentle and fertile, the most agricultural of the three, and looks south toward the rest of Europe. And out in the Atlantic, Iceland, settled during this very age by people mostly from Norway, is a volcanic island of grass and lava and glacier at the edge of the habitable world, with no trees to speak of after the first generations had cut them, and a climate that punishes any mistake. In all of these places, the fundamental facts were the same: a short, intense summer, a long, hard winter, and a growing season so brief that everything depended on making the very most of the light. This is the single most important thing to understand about life in the north. Everything in the year bends around that shortage of summer. In the far north, the summer days barely darken at all, and the sun hardly sets, and people work through what should be the night, because they can, and because they must. And then the light drains away through autumn, and by midwinter the day is a brief gray glow around noon, and the rest is darkness. Weeks upon weeks of it, and there is nothing to be done outdoors but the tending of the animals, and everyone comes inside, and the long fireside season begins. And that is why the longhouse looks the way it does. Every feature of it is an answer to that fact. It is long and low and hunkered into the ground because it must shed the wind. Its walls are massively thick because warmth is life. It has few openings and often no windows at all for the same reason. It brings the animals under the same roof because their bodies are a source of heat and because they must be protected from the weather too. It has a fire down the middle rather than at one end because that fire has to heat the whole space and be reachable from everywhere. And it is a single great room rather than a warren of small ones, because the household lives together, all of them, in the warm, through the dark half of the year. The longhouse is not merely a building. It is a machine for surviving winter, and it is the physical shape of a whole way of life. Let us look more closely at how such a house was actually made, for it is a remarkable piece of building, worked out over many centuries by people with no machinery, and, in some places, almost no timber. A typical longhouse might be 60 or 70 feet long and 15 or 20 wide, though the halls of great chieftains could run to well over 100 feet, vast dim spaces that must have been genuinely awe-inspiring when filled with firelight and people. The shape was not a plain rectangle. The walls usually bowed gently outward at the middle, so that the building was widest in the center and tapered toward both ends. A shape that is both stronger against wind and pleasing to the eye. And that gives the finished house the look of an overturned boat. The frame came first. 2 rows of stout wooden posts set into the ground down the length of the building, carrying the weight of the roof on beams above. These posts divided the interior into a wide central aisle, where the hearth ran, and 2 lower side aisles along the walls, which became the benches. The roof was carried on rafters from those beams down to the tops of the walls, and covered with layers of birch bark to shed water, and then with turf, cut in thick sods from the meadow, and laid grass side down, and then grass side up, sometimes to a depth of a foot or more. That turf roof was heavy, and it needed a strong frame, but it was a superb insulator, and it grew and lived, so that a longhouse in summer stood green and flowering, indistinguishable, at a distance from the hillside behind it. The walls varied with what the land provided. Where timber was plentiful, as in much of Norway and Sweden, walls might be built of horizontal planks or staves of wood. Where timber was scarce, as in Iceland and the Atlantic settlements, the walls were built of turf, cut into blocks and stacked in careful patterns, sometimes in herringbone courses, often with a core of earth and stone between 2 turf faces, and they might be 5 or 6 feet thick. Such a wall is astonishingly effective. It is warm, it is windproof, it is free, and it can be built by a household with hand tools. It is also alive and constantly decaying, and needs rebuilding every few decades, which is one reason the archaeology of these places shows house upon house upon house, each generation building anew on or beside the ruins of the last. Inside, the floor was of packed earth, sometimes strewn with rushes or straw, and the long hearth ran down the middle, lined and edged with stones. The raised benches along both walls were the great multi-purpose furniture of the house. You sat on them by day, worked on them, ate on them, and slept on them at night, wrapped in wool blankets and furs and skins, with your feet toward the fire. In wealthier houses, the benches might be built up with boards and hung with woven textiles along the wall behind, and the high seat, the place of the master of the house, stood at the middle of one long side, flanked by carved posts, which were objects of real significance. There are stories of settlers sailing to Iceland who threw their high seat posts overboard as they neared land and settled wherever the sea carried them ashore. Storage was everywhere. Chests along the walls holding clothes and tools and valuables. Barrels and casks, hanging shelves, sacks, and the great vertical loom standing against the gable wall. At one end, in many houses, was the byre for the cattle, sometimes separated by a partition, sometimes flowing into the same space, with stalls and a drain, and beyond or beside the main hall there might be additional rooms and outbuildings, a dairy, a storeroom, a smithy set apart because of the fire risk, a bathhouse or sauna in some regions, a pit-house workshop dug partly into the ground where the weaving or other crafts were done. And it must be said plainly that the interior was dark, and it was smoky. There was no chimney in the sense we would recognize, only a smoke hole in the roof, and the smoke gathered thickly above head height and filtered out slowly. Below it the air was breathable, which is precisely why the benches are low, and why people sat rather than stood. Anyone who has spent an evening in a reconstructed longhouse will tell you that you learn very quickly to keep your head down. The smoke had its uses. It preserved the meat and fish hung in the rafters, and it kept insects out of the thatch. But it also, over a lifetime, damaged eyes and lungs, and it is one of the small ordinary hardships of that life, which no romantic picture of the North ever includes. Now let us meet the people who lived in it, for a longhouse held a great deal more than a modern family. The household was the basic unit of this whole society, far more than the individual, and it was large. At the center stood the farmer and his wife, the master and mistress of the house, and their children. Around them lived whatever other kin belonged to the household: an aged parent, an unmarried sister, a widowed aunt, a fostered child from another family, perhaps a grown son with his own wife and children if the farm could support them. Beyond the kin came the hired hands and servants, free people who worked for their keep and a wage, sometimes for a season and sometimes for life. And at the bottom, in most households of any substance, were the enslaved. We must be honest about this, for slavery was woven right through the fabric of the Viking world, and it is one of the things most thoroughly softened away in the popular picture. The unfree were called thralls, and they were the property of the household. Some had been captured in raids abroad and brought home, and this was one of the principal purposes of raiding, not only gold and silver, but people, to be kept, or very often sold on, for the Scandinavians were among the great slave traders of early medieval Europe, funneling captives east along the Russian rivers to the markets of the Islamic world, and south to the Mediterranean. Others were born into slavery, the children of thralls. Others still had fallen into it through debt or as punishment for crime. A thrall did the heaviest and dirtiest work of the farm, the mucking out, the grinding of grain, the fetching of water and fuel, the herding, the peat cutting. They had almost no legal standing. The compensation owed for killing one was a payment to the owner for damaged property, rather than a wergild owed to a family. And yet the picture is not uniformly black, and the old law codes and stories show something more complicated. Thralls who were given a plot of land to work in their own time, and could accumulate enough to buy their freedom, thralls freed by their masters. Sometimes in wills, sometimes as a religious act after the coming of Christianity, freedmen who nonetheless remained tied to their former owners' families for a generation or more. And the plain fact that in a small household everyone worked side by side at the same tasks in the same room, so that the distance between free and unfree in daily life might be small even where the distance in law was absolute. It was a hierarchy, but it was a hierarchy lived at close quarters, all winter, around one fire. Above the household stood the wider ranks of society, and they were fairly simple. There were the jarls, the great men, the chieftains and magnates, and above them, the kings, who ruled through their followers and their gifts and their reputation. There were the carls, the free farmers, the great backbone of the population, men who owned their land or rented it, who bore arms, who attended the assembly, who had a voice. And there were the thralls. A free farmer of modest means was, importantly, a full member of society with rights and standing, and this relative broadness of freedom, compared with much of contemporary Europe, is one of the genuinely distinctive things about the Scandinavian world. There was no serfdom binding a peasant to the soil, no elaborate feudal ladder. A carl might be poor, but he was nobody's man but his own, and he could stand up at the assembly and speak. And a chieftain's power rested not on land alone but on people, on how many free men would follow him, and that depended on his reputation, his generosity, his success, and his luck. He had to give arms, arm rings, ships, feasts, silver. A generous lord attracted followers. A stingy one lost them. The poetry of the age is full of praise for the ring giver, the gold scatterer, the lord who does not hoard, and this is not mere flattery, but the description of a functioning political economy. Wealth flowed to a chieftain through trade and raiding and tribute, and it had to flow out again through his open hands, or his hall would empty, and his power would drain away. Let us turn now to the women of the Longhouse, for they held a position that was, by the standards of early medieval Europe, unusually strong, and their work was quite literally the foundation on which the whole seafaring world of the North was built. The mistress of the house was the ruler of everything within its walls. And this was not a figure of speech but a recognized authority with a physical symbol. She carried the keys of the household, hanging at her belt, the keys to the chests in the stores. And those keys appear so often in graves that they seem to have been a badge of the office. She controlled the food supply, which in a subsistence economy through a long winter is very nearly the same as controlling life. She directed the dairy and the brewing and the textile work, managed the servants and thralls, and when her husband was away, which he might be for whole seasons at a time on trading voyages or raids or at war, she ran the entire farm. The law gave her real standing. A woman could own property and keep it in marriage. She brought a dowry which remained hers. She could inherit, in certain circumstances, particularly if there were no sons. She could initiate a divorce, and the sagas show women doing exactly that, declaring themselves divorced before witnesses, for reasons ranging from a husband's violence to his inability to provide to complaints about his behavior in bed. She could bring a case before the assembly, usually through a male representative, and she could hold the moral authority to demand that her kinsmen take action. In the sagas, indeed, it is very often the women who drive the feuds, refusing to let a killing go unavenged, goading their sons and husbands with sharp words until blood is repaid with blood. Whether that reflects the reality of the 9th century or the imagination of the 13th century writers, it tells us that the idea of the formidable, decisive Norse woman was entirely familiar to the people who told these stories. And then there is the textile work, which deserves to be understood properly, because it is one of the most underestimated facts of the entire Viking age. Everything these people wore was made by hand from raw wool or flax, sheared, cleaned, combed, spun into thread on a drop spindle, dyed, woven on an upright warp-weighted loom, cut and sewn. That is an immense quantity of labor, and it fell overwhelmingly to women, and it never stopped. A woman's hands were almost never idle. Spinning could be done while walking, while watching children, while talking by the fire, and the spindle whorls turn up in the archaeology by the hundreds. But the clothing was only the beginning. Consider the sail. A Viking longship carried a great square sail of wool, and to make one such sail required an astounding investment, the wool of many dozens of sheep, and by careful modern estimates, something on the order of several years of one woman's working time, spinning and weaving, to produce a single sail for a single ship. Every ship that ever raided a monastery, every ship that crossed to Iceland or Greenland or the coast of North America, every trading vessel that went east to the rivers of Russia, moved under a sail that represented years of women's labor. The expansion of the Viking world across the oceans was, in a very real and literal sense, powered by the spinning and weaving done by women sitting on those benches through those long dark winters. It is one of the great unsung facts of medieval history, and once you know it, you cannot look at a picture of a longship the same way again. Let us eat then, for the food of the North is well known to us now, from the bones and seeds and residues that archaeologists recover, and from the written sources. And it was plainer than a feast hall painting suggests, but a great deal better than you might fear. The staples were dairy, grain, fish and meat, in proportions that varied enormously with the region and the season and the wealth of the household. Dairy was central. Cows and sheep and goats were milked, and the milk was turned into butter, into cheese, and above all, into a thick soured milk product, a kind of strained yogurt or curd, which the Icelanders still make today under the old name, and which was eaten constantly. Butter was stored in barrels and could be kept for a very long time, sometimes sunk in bogs, and it appears in the sources as a form of wealth in its own right, paid in rents and taxes. Grain was mostly barley, with oats and rye where they would grow, and wheat as a luxury in the south. It was ground on a hand quern, a heavy pair of stone discs turned by hand, and the labor of grinding, like the labor of spinning, was constant and fell largely to the women and the thralls. Most of it became porridge, thick and filling, eaten daily, or flat unleavened breads baked on a griddle or a hot stone by the fire. And a great deal of it became ale, which we will come to. Meat was more plentiful in the north than in much of medieval Europe, because so much of the land was better suited to pasture than to crops. Beef, mutton, goat, and pork, and in Iceland and the islands, a great deal of mutton indeed. Horse meat was eaten as well, and would later become a point of real conflict when Christianity arrived, since eating horse was associated with pagan sacrifice and was condemned. There were hens for eggs and meat, and hunting brought in reindeer, elk, seabirds and their eggs, seals, and, out in the Atlantic settlements, whales when one stranded, which was an event of such importance that the old word for a stranded whale came to mean any sudden windfall of good fortune. And there was fish, endlessly, cod, herring, salmon, trout, and shellfish. The most important preservation method in the north was drying. Cod split and hung on wooden racks in the cold, dry sea wind until it became stockfish, hard as board, keeping for years, needing only to be soaked and pounded to become food again. Stockfish would go on to become one of the great trade goods of northern Europe for centuries. Fish was also salted and smoked in the rafters, and in Iceland and Scandinavia soured in whey, which preserved and also produced some of the more challenging traditional foods that survive to this day. Add to this what could be gathered and grown: onions, cabbage, peas and beans, turnips, herbs, wild greens, seaweed along the coasts, and berries in enormous quantity in late summer, bilberries and lingonberries and cloudberries, gathered and eaten fresh or preserved. Honey, where bees could be kept or wild nests found, was the only sweetener, and it was precious, and it made mead. And drink was ale. Everyone drank it, adults and children, weak ale by day and stronger for feasts. Brewed from barley in the household, generally by the women, a fundamental part of the diet rather than a mere indulgence, and safer and more nourishing than water alone. Mead, fermented from honey, was rarer and more prestigious. Drink of the feast and the poem. Wine came in from the south by trade, and was the drink of the wealthy and the great occasion. And the vessels tell their own story. Wooden bowls and cups for every day, horns for the feast, and among the graves of the rich glass and imported metalwork from the Rhineland and beyond, brought north by trade or by plunder, and set out on the bench beside the ordinary wooden ware. Now let us follow the year around, for the shape of a life in the north was dictated by the seasons more absolutely than almost anything else, and each part of the year had its own character and its own anxieties. Before we follow the year around, let us look at what these people actually wore, since it sat on their bodies every day of their lives, and since the popular picture of it is so badly wrong. Forget the shaggy furs and the bare arms. Norse dress was woolen, layered, well-made, and often brightly colored, and it was designed with great practicality for a cold, wet climate. A man wore a linen or wool undershirt, then a woolen tunic reaching to the thigh, belted at the waist, with the belt carrying a knife, a purse, and whatever small tools he needed, since there were no pockets. Below that, trousers, sometimes narrow, sometimes the very full baggy kind that appear in Eastern-influenced regions, with the lower legs often wound with strips of cloth called leg wrappings, which give warmth and support and keep the trouser out of the mud. On the feet, turn shoes of soft leather, sewn inside out and reversed, comfortable and completely unwaterproof, stuffed with wool or grass in winter. Over everything, a heavy woolen cloak, fastened at the right shoulder with a pin or brooch so that the sword arm stayed free, and in the coldest weather that cloak might be a thick shaggy pile weave, deliberately woven with long tufts to shed rain and snow like a fleece. A woman wore a long linen underdress, sometimes finely pleated, and over it the distinctive garment of the age, a woolen overdress, a kind of pinafore, suspended from two shoulder straps that were fastened at the front with a pair of large oval brooches, one on each side. Those paired brooches are so characteristic that archaeologists use them as a marker of Scandinavian female burial across the whole Viking world. Between the two brooches a string of beads was often hung, of glass and amber and sometimes carnelian or rock crystal from far away, and from them also hung the small tools of daily life and, in the case of the mistress of the house, the keys. Over that came a shawl or a coat, and on the head, at least for married women, some form of cap or kerchief. The colors are the thing most often forgotten. These people dyed their cloth, and they liked strong color. Reds from madder, blues from wove, yellows and greens from plants and lichens, and undyed wool in every natural shade from cream to black. Bright colors and imported fabrics were expensive and were worn to show it. The wealthy trimmed their garments with strips of silk brought from the East and with woven braids threaded with silver and gold. A prosperous household on a feast day would have been a considerably more colorful sight than any film has ever bothered to show. And they cared how they looked. We have already met the combs and the weekly washing. Men wore their beards and hair in styles distinctive enough that outsiders remarked on them. There is a description of a fashion in England for the hair shaved at the back and long in front. Both sexes use tweezers. There is even evidence of eye cosmetics among some of the Eastern travelers. The image of the unwashed savage is a slander invented by the people they raided, and it has proved remarkably hard to kill. The year's great pivot was the hay. In a land where animals cannot graze outdoors through the winter, everything depends on cutting and drying enough grass in the summer to feed every beast in the byre until the spring. This is the single most important work of the year, and it is done in a race against the weather, in a climate where the weather is never reliable. Through the high summer weeks, the whole household is out with scythes and rakes, cutting, turning, drying, carting, stacking, working the long, bright hours of the northern day, sometimes very nearly around the clock. And on how much hay comes in depends how many animals can be kept through to the spring, and therefore how much milk and meat and wool there will be in the year to come. Get it right and the farm prospers. Get it wrong, or lose the crop to weeks of rain, and animals must be slaughtered in the autumn that should have lived, and the following year is poorer, and if it happens twice in a row. People go hungry. Spring was the season of hope and of the greatest hunger. The stores from the previous year were at their lowest, the animals thin and weak after a winter in the byre, and the new growth had not yet come. This is the hungry gap that all northern farming societies knew. When at last the grass came, the animals were turned out, and often driven up into the high pastures, to summer huts in the hills, where some of the household, frequently the young women, lived for weeks at a stretch, milking the herd and making cheese and butter far from the home farm. The ground was plowed, and the barley sown. Summer was light in labor, and also the season of movement. This was when the ships went out, to fish, to trade, to visit kin, to attend the assemblies, and, for some, to go raiding. The seas were open, and the days were endless, and the young men who were going to go Viking went now, because they could be spared from the farm between the sowing and the harvest, and because they would need to be home again before the autumn storms. Autumn was harvest and reckoning. The barley came in and was threshed. The animals were brought down from the hills. And then came the great slaughter, the killing of the beasts that could not be fed through the winter, and with it a brief season of unusual plenty, fresh meat and blood, and offal, feasting, and then the hard work of preserving what remained by salting, smoking, drying, and souring. This slaughter was tied to one of the great religious festivals of the year, and it is easy to see why. The moment when a community kills its animals and eats and gives thanks and asks for a good winter is a natural place for ritual. And then the dark came down, and everyone went inside. Winter was the season of the longhouse. There was work still to be done, the animals to be fed and mucked out daily, tools and gear to be repaired, wool to be spun and cloth to be woven, wood and antler and bone to be carved, ropes to be made, nets to be mended, ale to be brewed. But the work was indoor work, done close together in the firelight, and the days were so short that much of it was done by lamp and flame. And in the middle of that darkness came the greatest feast of the year, midwinter, the festival that later merged with Christmas, when the household ate and drank the best of what it had, and made oaths, and the darkest weeks of the year were pushed back a little by light and noise and company. And after it, the slow climb back toward the light, the days lengthening minute by minute, the anxious watching of the stores, and at last the spring again, and the whole wheel turning once more. And a word about the animals, since they shared the roof, and since the whole enterprise rested on them. The most valuable was the cow, kept above all for milk rather than meat, and a household's wealth could reasonably be counted in cattle. The byre at the end of the house was full of the family's capital, breathing in the dark. Norse cattle were small by modern standards, and they came through the winter thin and weak, sometimes so weak by spring that they had to be carried out of the byre to the first grass, which happened often enough to be a recognized thing rather than a disaster. Sheep were the true workhorse of the northern farm, and especially out in the Atlantic settlements. They gave wool, which meant clothing and sails and trade goods. They gave milk, which meant cheese and butter and skyer. They gave meat and tallow and skins, and they could feed themselves on ground that would support nothing else, foraging on the hills and in the islands, along the shore on seaweed. Goats did much the same and were even less fussy. Pigs were kept where there was woodland to feed them, and were pure meat, fattened and killed. Hens gave eggs. Geese and ducks were kept in places. And there was the horse, which occupied a peculiar and elevated place. Horses were transport and status, and in a country of no roads, the only practical way to travel by land. They were also, importantly, sacred. Horses were sacrificed. Horse meat was eaten at the pagan feasts, and horses were buried with their owners in considerable numbers. There was also the sport of horse fighting, in which two stallions were set against one another with their handlers alongside, an occasion for crowds and betting, and in saga after saga, for a quarrel that ends in someone's death. And when Christianity came, the eating of horse became one of the sharpest points of conflict, precisely because it was so entangled with the old religion. The dogs worked and hunted and were companions, and are found in graves beside their people. Cats were kept, and their bones turn up in the towns, and they had their place in the mythology too. Drawing the goddess's chariot, they were also, less charmingly, skinned for fur, which the archaeology makes clear. And every farm lived alongside its animals to an extent no modern person quite grasps, knew them individually, named them, depended on them absolutely, killed them when it had to, and slept a few yards from them all winter with only a partition between. Let us take up now the question of the raiding, since it is the thing everyone knows about, and it deserves an honest treatment rather than either a horror story or an excuse. It began, in the historical record, at the very end of the 8th century, when ships came out of the sea to a small island monastery off the coast of northern England and sacked it, killing and enslaving the monks and carrying off the treasures of the church. The monks of Europe wrote about it in tones of shock and horror, and their accounts have shaped the reputation of these people ever since. Why did it start? There is no single agreed answer, but several pressures seem to have converged. There was a shortage of good land at home in a society where farms were divided among heirs and the population was rising, which left many young men with poor prospects and much energy. There was the perfecting of the ship, and this is crucial. The Scandinavians had developed a vessel of extraordinary capability, shallow enough to run up a beach, or far up a river, seaworthy enough to cross open ocean, fast under sail and workable under oars, and it gave them a reach and a suddenness that no one on the other side could counter. There was the discovery, through trade contacts, that the monasteries and towns of Christian Europe were full of portable wealth and almost entirely undefended. A monastery on an island had no walls and no soldiers, because no one had ever needed them. And there was the internal political logic of a society, where a chieftain's power depended on his ability to give gifts and reward followers, which made a successful raiding voyage the fastest route to status for an ambitious man. The raids themselves were at the beginning small and opportunistic, a few ships, a quick strike on a coastal target, away before any response could gather. Over the decades they grew larger and more organized, into fleets, and then into armies that wintered abroad, that took tribute from kings, that campaigned for years, and that eventually stopped going home at all and began seizing land and settling it. And that is the crucial transformation of the Viking Age. It began as raiding and became migration. Great swathes of eastern England came under Scandinavian rule and settlement. Northern France was ceded to a Norse leader and became Normandy. Ireland's first true towns, including Dublin, were founded as Norse trading bases. Orkney and Shetland and the Hebrides became Norse lands and remained so for centuries. Iceland was settled from empty. Greenland was settled from Iceland. And a Norse expedition reached the coast of North America and built a camp there, 500 years before Columbus, the remains of which have been excavated at the northern tip of Newfoundland. And eastward, meanwhile, the Swedes went the other way, down the great rivers of Eastern Europe in smaller boats, portaging between watersheds, trading furs and slaves, and amber for the silver of the Islamic world, founding and ruling settlements along the way, reaching the Black Sea and the Caspian, and the walls of Constantinople itself, where their descendants served as the elite guard of the emperors. Enormous quantities of Arabic silver coin have been dug up in Sweden, brought home along that eastern route, and the sheer scale of it tells you that trade, not plunder, was the true engine of the eastern venture. So we must hold both truths at once. These were people who did real and terrible violence, who burned settlements, killed the defenseless, and took human beings as merchandise, and whose victims left us no shortage of testimony to the horror of it. And they were also traders, explorers, settlers, craftsmen and farmers, who opened routes across half the known world, founded cities that still stand, and crossed an ocean no one else had crossed. The same ships did both, and often the same men, in different seasons of the same life. To insist only on the violence is to miss most of what they were. To wave it away is to lie to the people they harmed. And since we have come this far, let us look honestly at how these people actually fought, because here too the popular picture is largely invention. Begin with the helmet. There were no horns. Not one horned helmet has ever been found in a Viking Age context, and the idea comes from 19th century romantic painting and opera costume, not from the ground. Only one reasonably complete helmet of the period has been found in Scandinavia at all, and it is a plain rounded iron cap with a spectacle-like guard over the eyes and nose. Most men, in fact, probably had no helmet, because iron was expensive. The characteristic weapon of the ordinary man was not the sword, but the spear and the axe. A spear is cheap, needs little metal, can be thrown or held, and works in a formation. An axe is a tool that every household already owns, and which becomes a weapon by being carried to a fight. The great two-handed broad axe of the later age was a specialized weapon, but most axes in most hands were farm axes. Nearly everyone carried a knife of some kind at all times, since it was needed to eat. The sword was the aristocrat's weapon, expensive, prestigious, named, inherited, and buried with its owner. Defense was the shield, a round board of thin planks, perhaps a yard across, with an iron boss over a central hand grip, and often a rim of rawhide or leather, light enough to be moved quickly and treated as an active weapon rather than a passive wall, to be punched and hooked and used to bind an opponent's blade. It was also, in the nature of thin wood, consumable. A shield came apart under hard use, which is why they were carried in quantity on ships. Body armor was rare. A mail shirt was the possession of a wealthy man and represented a great deal of skilled labor, thousands of small rings each riveted closed. Most fighters wore thick wool and leather, and their luck. And the fighting itself was not the wild individual berserk melee of the films. Where we can reconstruct it, it looks like disciplined close-order work with shields overlapped. A shoving, stabbing, exhausting business of holding a line and trying to break the other one, decided as often by nerve and stamina as by skill. Battles were relatively small. A great army of the age might be a few thousand men, and many a famous fight involved a few hundred. Raids more often involved no real fighting at all, which was the entire point. Arrive where no one is prepared, take what can be carried, and leave before anything organized arrives. What the sources do convey, and what may be true, is a particular attitude toward all this. A hard, fatalistic, faintly humorous readiness that runs from the mythology down into the sagas. If the gods themselves march knowingly toward a battle they will lose, then a man may as well meet his own end, with a level voice, and, if he can manage it, a good line. Whether many actually did is another question, but it is what they admired, and what a society admires tells you a great deal about it. Since the ship stands behind everything, let us look at it properly, for it is the supreme achievement of this civilization, and the thing that best repays a quiet hour's attention. We know these vessels intimately because the Scandinavians sometimes buried their great dead in ships, and because ships were sunk deliberately to block harbor channels, and both circumstances have preserved actual hulls, which archaeologists have raised and reconstructed, so that we are not guessing. The construction is the heart of it. A Norse ship was built shell first, the keel laid. Then the planks of the hull fitted one above another, each overlapping the one below like the boards of a fence, riveted together with iron nails clenched over small square plates, and the seams caulked with tarred animal hair or wool. Only when the shell of the hull was complete were the internal frames fitted inside it, and, crucially, the frames were often lashed to cleats left standing proud on the planks rather than nailed rigidly. The result is a hull that flexes. It gives with the sea instead of fighting it, and it can be built astonishingly light for its size, and it draws very little water. The wood was oak, where it could be had, and it was not sawn but split radially from the log with wedges and axes, which follows the grain, and produces planks of great strength and springiness, with very little waste of the timber's natural structure. The whole thing was shaped by eye and by experience, without written plans, by shipwrights who carried the proportions in their heads and their hands. What that produced was a vessel of remarkable versatility. The long, narrow warship, the one everyone pictures, was fast and shallow, and rowed by dozens of men when the wind failed, able to be run straight onto a beach and pushed off again, able to go far up a river to a town that thought itself safe. But there was also the broader, deeper cargo vessel, higher-sided and largely dependent on sail, with a hold amidships for cargo and a smaller crew, and it was this workhorse, not the sleek raider, that carried the emigrants and their cattle to Iceland and Greenland, and the stockfish and furs and walrus ivory back east. And then there was the navigation, which is genuinely astonishing when you consider it. To sail from Norway to Iceland is to cross 600 or 700 miles of open North Atlantic, out of sight of land for days, in a boat with no compass, no chart, no instrument we would recognize. They did it by knowledge, by latitude sailing, holding a course by the height of the sun at midday and the pole star at night, using the sun's position and the direction of the prevailing swell and the wind, by reading the sea itself, its color and its life, by watching for the clouds that pile up over land beyond the horizon, by knowing the flight paths of seabirds, which go out from land in the morning and back to it in the evening, and even, according to the sagas, by carrying ravens aboard and releasing one to see which way it flew. They knew that if you held a certain latitude westward, you would strike Iceland, and if you overran it, you would find Greenland. And there are sailing directions preserved in the old texts that give the route in exactly those terms, with the day's sailing and the landmarks to look for. It was not luck. It was a body of hard-won practical science, held entirely in memory, and it took them across an ocean. Let us come back inside now, out of the wind, and look at the work of the hands, at the crafts that filled the winter and furnished the house. for these were people of very considerable skill, and one of the pleasures of their archaeology is how much beautiful ordinary work survives. The smith held a special place, a little apart and a little feared, working iron out of bog ore, smelted in small clay furnaces, making the nails and rivets, the axes and knives and scythes and sickles, the cauldron chains and the door hinges, and, at the top of the art, the weapons. A good sword was an object of enormous value, often pattern welded from twisted rods of iron and steel, forged together, which produced both a superior blade and a rippling pattern in the metal that looked like smoke or running water. Such swords had names, and were handed down, and were mourned when lost. The smith's craft carried an air of the uncanny. In the old stories, smiths are makers of magical things, and the god of the north who lost his hand and the dwarves who forged the god's treasures all belonged to that same imaginative world. Then there was woodwork, and it was everywhere, because in a timber culture nearly everything is wood: bowls turned on a pole lathe, buckets and barrels built by coopers, chests, sledges, wagons, looms, beds, doors, and the ships themselves. And a great deal of it was carved, richly and confidently, in the interlacing animal styles that ran through the whole of Norse art: long, sinuous, gripping beasts, twining ribbons of body and limb, the eye chasing a line around and around, and never quite finding the end of it. It appears on ship prows, on sledges, on doorposts, on the little everyday objects, and on the great carved stones. These were not people who left surfaces plain if they could help it. There was work in bone and antler, which gave the household its combs, and the combs deserve a moment, because they overturn a stubborn myth. The Norse were not filthy. Combs are among the most common objects found in their settlements and graves, made of antler and composite plates riveted together, and often carried in a case at the belt. Alongside them turn up tweezers, ear spoons, and razors. There is a well-known complaint from an English writer of the period that the Danish settlers were altogether too fastidious for the local taste, combing their hair daily, bathing on Saturdays, and changing their clothes often, and thereby turning the heads of the local women. The old word for Saturday in the Scandinavian languages means, quite literally, washing day, and it still does. These were people who bathed weekly, in an age when much of Europe did not, and who took very evident care of their appearance. There was weaving and sewing, as we have seen, and dyeing with plants that gave good strong colors: blues from woad, reds from madder, yellows from weld and lichens. There was leather work for shoes and belts and scabbards, rope making from bast and hide and horsehair, net making, basketry. There was soapstone, quarried and carved into bowls and pots, and loom weights and spindle whorls, particularly in Norway, where it was a major export. And there was jewelry, and here the wealth of the age shows itself: the great oval brooches worn in pairs by women to fasten the shoulder straps of their overdress, penannular brooches and cloak pins for men, arm rings and neck rings of silver, beads of glass and amber and carnelian traded in from far away, and pendants of every kind, including the little hammers of the thunder god that people wore around their necks, and which turn up, tellingly, alongside crosses in the transitional years, sometimes even made in the same molds. Now let us consider how these people governed themselves, for they had no police, no standing courts of the kind we know, and in many places no effective king at all, and yet they were not lawless. Far from it. This was a society obsessed with law, and its central institution was the assembly, the thing. The thing was a gathering of the free men of a district, held at a fixed place, at a fixed season, at which disputes were heard, judgments given, and the law was spoken aloud. Anyone with standing could bring a case, and the community judged. There was no state to enforce a verdict. Enforcement depended on the collective pressure of neighbors and the willingness of a man's kin to back him. And because the law was not written down, it had to be memorized, and in Iceland this produced one of the most remarkable offices in medieval Europe, the law speaker, elected for a term, whose duty was to know the entire body of law by heart, and to recite a third of it aloud each summer from the rock at the National Assembly, so that over a 3-year term the whole law was publicly spoken through. That Icelandic assembly deserves its own word. When settlers from Norway filled up Iceland in the late 9th century, they built a society with no king at all, and in the year 930 they established a national assembly on a plain of black lava with a cliff wall behind it that throws the voice back. And there, once a year, in the endless light of the northern summer, the whole country gathered, chieftains and farmers, litigants and witnesses, traders and brewers and gossips, and young people looking for a match. Law was made, cases were heard, alliances were formed, marriages arranged, news exchanged, and then everyone rode home again. It ran, in one form or another, for centuries, and it is often described as one of the oldest parliaments in the world. The law itself was concerned above all with property, injury, and killing, and it worked largely through compensation. There was a tariff, a scale of payments, so much for a killing, so much for a wound of such and such a kind, so much for an insult, so much for the theft of a beast. The purpose of it was practical rather than moral, to give an injured family an alternative to vengeance, an honorable way to accept payment instead of blood, and so to stop a killing from generating another killing forever. Because that was the danger, and it was very real. Beneath the law lay the feud, and the feud lay at the heart of this society's imagination, and, often enough, of its actual history. Honor was not a decoration, but a working asset. A man with a reputation for letting insults pass was a man whose property and family were not safe. So insults had to be answered, and killings had to be answered, and every answer created a new grievance on the other side. And the sagas are essentially long, patient, devastating studies of how this works. How a trivial quarrel over a horse or a hayfield or a slighting word escalates, step by inevitable step, over years and generations, through lawsuits and ambushes and burnings, consuming families who all along know perfectly well where it is going and cannot stop. And the greatest penalty the law could impose was not death, but outlawry. The formal declaration that a man was outside the law altogether, that he might be killed by anyone without consequence, that no one might feed, or shelter, or ferry him. Lesser outlawry meant exile for a term of years. Full outlawry meant permanent expulsion from human society. In a country where survival depends on a household and a farm and a network of kin, to be put outside all of that was a sentence of appalling severity. And the great outlaw stories of the North, the tales of men who survived for years alone in the mountains and the wastelands, hunted and unhouseled, are among the most powerful things these people ever wrote. Let us turn to the gods, then, and to how these people understood the world they lived in. And the first thing to say is that their religion was not much like what we mean by that word. There was no church, no scripture, no creed, no priesthood in the professional sense, no requirement to believe any particular thing. There was instead a body of stories, a set of customary practices, and a great many local variations, all bound up with the ordinary life of the farm and the community. The chieftain who led the sacrifice was the same man who led the assembly and owned the farm. Religion was not a separate department of life. The gods themselves are familiar to us because the stories were written down, mostly in Iceland, mostly a couple of centuries after the conversion, by Christians who valued the old poetry, which means we see them through a certain glass, but they come through vividly. There is the one-eyed god of wisdom, poetry, magic, and the dead, who traded an eye for knowledge and hanged himself on the world tree for 9 nights to win the runes. A figure of dark and unreliable brilliance, patron of kings and of poets, and no friend to anyone in particular. There is the red-bearded thunder god with his hammer, straightforward and immensely strong, defender of gods and men against the giants, and by far the most popular deity among ordinary farming people, whose hammer they wore around their necks. There is the goddess of love and fertility and war and the slain, who drives a chariot drawn by cats and takes half the battle dead to her own hall. There is the shining god who dies, and the trickster, who causes it. A figure of pure ambiguity, who is companion to the gods and will lead their enemies at the end. And that ending is the strangest and most distinctive thing about the whole mythology. These gods are not eternal, and they are not going to win. It is foretold that there will come a final winter and a final battle, in which the gods and their enemies will destroy one another. The wolf will swallow the sun, the earth will sink into the sea, and everything will end. And the gods know this. They know exactly how it goes, and who kills whom, and that they will lose, and they go on anyway, and they fight anyway, because that is what one does. It is a mythology whose central figures face certain defeat with their eyes open and refuse to be diminished by it. Whatever else may be said about these people, that says something about how they preferred to see themselves. The practice of the religion was mostly sacrifice and feast, and the two were the same thing. At the great seasonal turnings, the community gathered. Animals were killed. The blood was sprinkled about the place and the participants. The meat was cooked and eaten, and ale was drunk, and toasts were made and oaths were sworn over the cup. To sacrifice was to share a meal with the gods, and the gift given expected a gift in return, a good year, a fair wind, a victory, a healthy child. There were sacred places, groves and springs and hills, and some larger temples, though far fewer than the later Christian writers imagined. There were household observances, offerings to the spirits of the land and the ancestors and the guardians of the farm, small daily and seasonal courtesies to the unseen neighbors on whom prosperity depended, and these were probably the most constant religious experience of most people's lives. And there was magic, and it was taken very seriously. There were seers, most often women, who traveled between farms and were received with honor, who sat on a raised platform and, with the help of chanting, went into a trance and answered questions about the coming season, the fortunes of the household, the fate of individuals. There is a famous and detailed description of exactly such a ceremony in one of the Icelandic sagas, down to the seeress's clothing and staff, and the food she was given. Archaeologists have found, in a number of rich female graves, iron staffs that appear to match the descriptions of the staffs these women carried. Practitioners of another kind of sorcery, one associated with the one-eyed god and regarded as shameful for men to practice, could reportedly curse, heal, raise storms, and see at a distance. In a world without medicine or forecasting or news, and with a very great deal of darkness, the ability to say what was coming was a real and valuable power. And the people who had it held a real and slightly frightening place in the community. Before we come to the stories, a word about writing. For these people did have a script of their own, and it was not at all what most people assume. The runes were an alphabet, and a perfectly practical one developed centuries before the Viking Age, and used across the Germanic world. Their letter forms are made almost entirely of straight lines and diagonals, with very few curves, for the excellent reason that they were designed to be cut into wood along the grain, where a curve is difficult, and a horizontal line disappears into the grain altogether. By the Viking Age, the alphabet had been reduced, oddly, to only 16 characters, fewer than the sounds of the language required, so that a single rune had to serve for several different sounds, and reading depended heavily on context. It is as though the script had been deliberately simplified for people who used it constantly, and did not need it to be precise. And they did use it constantly, for ordinary things. This is the part most often missed. Runes were not primarily mystical. They were the everyday writing of a practical people. The waterlogged excavations in a Norwegian town produced hundreds of small pieces of wood inscribed with runes, and what they say is wonderfully mundane. Ownership tags to be tied to bundles of goods, business notes, a request to send something, prayers, jokes, a schoolboy's practice, verses of poetry, a message from one man to another about a debt, complaints, and a fair amount of material that would not pass in polite company. Ordinary people writing ordinary things on scraps of wood and throwing them away. The grander use was the memorial stone, and thousands survive, particularly in Sweden. The formula is usually simple and always moving. Someone raised this stone in memory of someone, their father or brother or son, or, quite often, their wife or mother. And then, sometimes, a line about where he died or what he did. Through those lines the age speaks about itself. Men who died in the East, in the West, in England, in Greece, serving the emperor. In a land the stone names and we can barely place. A man who was the best of farmers. A man who owned a ship. A woman who was the most skillful in the district. Many are carved with the same twining beasts that decorate everything else, painted in bright colors when new. And some carry crosses alongside the older imagery, marking the years when the two worlds overlapped. And the runes did also carry a charge of the uncanny, because writing always does in a world where few can do it, and because the myth said the one-eyed god won them through suffering. There are inscriptions that are charms, meant to heal or curse or protect, and there is a story that a man carved runes wrongly and made a woman ill. And another had to scrape them off and cut the right ones to cure her. Both things were true at once. It was the alphabet you used to label a sack of grain, and it was the alphabet a god hanged himself to get. Now let us come to what they did with the winter nights, which is, in a sense, the whole point of tonight's journey. For the long dark of the northern year produced one of the richest storytelling cultures the world has ever known, and out of it came a literature that still stands with the finest anywhere. Picture the scene again. It is midwinter. The work of the day is done. The animals are fed. The fire is banked and glowing, and the lamps are lit, and everyone is on the benches with their hands busy, spinning, carving, mending, sewing. There is nowhere to go and nothing to see, and the dark outside will last another 16 hours. And so somebody talks. They told stories of the gods, and of heroes, and of dragons, and cursed gold and doomed lovers. They told the histories of their own families, the settlement of the land, the quarrels of great-grandfathers, the killings and the lawsuits, and the reconciliations, tracing genealogies with a precision that seems astonishing, until you realize that in a society without written records the genealogy is the deed to the farm, and the map of one's alliances. They told the news, which in an isolated country is a valuable commodity. And there are accounts of travelers being lodged for the winter, essentially in exchange for their stock of stories. They recited poetry, and Norse poetry was a formidable art, tightly ruled in its meter and alliteration, and prizing a peculiar kind of riddle-like metaphor, in which a ship becomes the horse of the sea becomes the whale road, gold becomes the fire of the river, blood becomes the wave of the wound, and a poet's skill was measured by his command of these condensed and glittering figures. A good poet could make a king's reputation, or destroy a man's with a mocking verse, and verses of mockery were serious enough that the law made them punishable. They asked riddles and played word games. They played board games, and the boards and pieces turn up in graves. The great one was a game of unequal sides, in which a king and his defenders in the center of the board try to break out to the edges, while a larger attacking force tries to surround and trap him. It is a game of siege and escape, and it must have been played on those benches by firelight through countless evenings. There is also gambling with dice, and drinking games and flighting, a formalized contest of insults conducted in verse, which was both entertainment and a way of testing a man's wit and nerve in public. And out of all this talking, over the centuries, came the sagas. It is worth being clear about what they are. The great Icelandic family sagas were written down in the 13th century, 200 or 300 years after the events they describe, in prose, by anonymous authors, drawing on generations of oral tradition. They are not straight history. They contain invention and shaping and the concerns of the era that wrote them. But they are also not romance. Their manner is dry, understated, unsentimental to a degree that can be startling. Characters are described from the outside, their feelings almost never stated, motive left to be inferred from action and from a few flat words of dialogue. A man is fatally wounded and remarks that broad spears are becoming fashionable. A woman refuses her husband a lock of her hair to make a bowstring in his last fight, reminding him of a slap he gave her years before, and he dies. There is no commentary. The effect, at its best, is devastating, and it is one of the reasons these 13th century farm country manuscripts are read today as world literature. And they are, incidentally, why we know so much about ordinary life in the North. Because they are stories about farmers, they are full of hay and horses and boundary disputes and household arrangements, and who sat where in the hall, all the domestic texture that a chronicle of kings would never bother to record. It is a curious gift. A people whose reputation is for burning libraries left us, out of their own long winters, one of the most detailed pictures of daily life anywhere in early medieval Europe. And it is worth saying plainly how unusual our sources are, because it explains why we can speak with any confidence at all about something as intimate as a household in the 9th century. Almost every other early medieval people is known to us mainly through the writing of churchmen, which means through the concerns of churchmen, kings, bishops, wars, miracles, land grants. The Norse world we can approach from 4 quite different directions at once, and where they agree we can be reasonably confident. There is the archaeology, and it is exceptionally good, partly because these people buried their dead with their possessions, and partly because the North preserves things. Waterlogged town deposits that keep leather and wood and textile, blue clay that keeps whole ships, Icelandic volcanic ash layers that date a floor to within a few years, and permafrost, and cold ground that keep what warmer countries lose. There are the outside observers, which is to say the people they visited, English and Frankish and Irish chroniclers writing in fear and fury. And, from the other end of the world, Arab and Byzantine writers, merchants and diplomats and geographers, who encountered Scandinavian traders on the eastern rivers and in the markets, and wrote about them with the fascinated curiosity of people describing a genuinely foreign culture. Those Eastern accounts are invaluable precisely because their authors had no stake in the Western quarrel, and simply reported what they saw, admiringly in some things, with revulsion in others. There are the runestones and inscriptions, the age's own voice, brief and unliterary and contemporary. And there are the sagas and poems, late and shaped and partly literary, but rooted in an oral tradition from within the society, and full of the domestic detail that no chronicler would ever think to write down. Set those 4 beside one another, and a world comes into focus that is far more three-dimensional than we have any right to expect from 1,000 years ago, on the edge of the map. And we should give proper time to the feast, for it was the great social institution of this world, the occasion on which a hall became more than a house, and it was governed by rules everybody understood. A feast might be held for a season's turning, a wedding, a funeral, the arrival of an important guest, or simply because a chieftain needed to gather his people and remind them what he was worth. The host provided everything, and lavishly, and to do it poorly was a lasting humiliation. Long tables were set up along the benches, or the benches themselves served. The best food came out. Fresh meat, which was otherwise a rarity outside the autumn slaughter, and butter, and bread, and above all the ale brewed in quantity for the occasion, and mead if the household had honey to spare. Seating was not casual. Where a person sat in the hall was a public statement of their standing, and the giving of the seat next to the host was an honor. And being placed further down was a message that everyone in the room could read. There are quarrels in the sagas that begin over exactly this. The mistress of the house carried the drinking horn around the hall in a formal circuit, and the order in which she served, and to whom she gave the first cup, was itself a piece of ceremony. Then came the drinking, and the drinking was not idle. Toasts were made, to the gods, to the ancestors, to the dead. Oaths were sworn over the cup, and an oath made in the hall in front of everyone was a serious and binding thing, and the sagas are full of men who swore magnificent boasts at a feast, and then had to spend the following year making good on them, sometimes at the cost of their lives. There was poetry, either recited from the tradition or composed on the spot in honor of the host, and a poet who could produce a good verse in praise of his lord went home with a gold ring for it. There was music, and there was almost certainly a great deal of noise. And underneath all the eating and drinking ran the real business of the evening, which was politics. Alliances were made at feasts. Marriages were arranged. Disputes were settled or, occasionally, started. Followings were confirmed by gifts handed over in public, where everyone could see them. An arm ring, a sword, a fine cloak, a ship. In a society without offices or bureaucracies, this was how power was actually transacted. Face to face, in the firelight, with witnesses, and bound up with all of it was hospitality, which was close to a sacred obligation. To arrive at a farm was to be taken in, fed, warmed, and lodged, and travelers in that country depended on it absolutely. Because in a landscape of scattered farms and long distances and murderous weather, a door that would not open was a death sentence. The old poems are full of advice on the subject, and they are surprisingly gentle and shrewd about it. That a guest arriving cold needs fire and food and a towel and a friendly welcome. That a man should not overstay, since even a welcome guest becomes tiresome. That no one is so poor that they have nothing to give, and no one so rich that they need nothing. It is a whole ethic of getting along with other people, worked out by a society that knew perfectly well how much everyone needed everyone else. Let us think about the children of that house, and about how a person grew up in it. Childhood in the Viking age was short. A newborn was, in the pre-Christian custom, presented to the father, who acknowledged it and had water sprinkled on it and gave it a name, and from that moment the child was a member of the family and could not lawfully be harmed. Before that acknowledgement, an unwanted or sickly infant might be exposed, a practice the sources mention plainly, and which the church campaigned hard against after the conversion. Names carried weight, and children were often named for a dead grandparent, in the belief that something of the person came with the name. After that, children grew up in the middle of the work. There were no schools. A child learned by being present and by helping, watching the sheep gathering fuel, minding the smaller ones, fetching and carrying, then gradually taking on the real tasks. Until at 12 or so a boy or girl was doing something close to adult work. Toys turn up in the ground, small wooden horses and boats, miniature weapons, animal figures carved from bone, and the ice skates made from horse bone that were strapped to the feet and used with a pole on frozen lakes, and which were clearly used by adults as well. One custom stands out and deserves mention: fostering. It was extremely common for a child, especially a boy, to be sent to be brought up in another household, often that of a kinsman, or a friend, or an ally of lower status. Fostering created a bond between the two families as strong as blood, an alliance renewed in every generation. And the relationship between a foster father and foster son, and between foster brothers, is treated in the sagas as one of the deepest of all human ties. It was also a form of social cement in a society with no state. It gave men in different districts an unbreakable reason to support one another. Marriage came early, and was arranged, and was fundamentally a contract between two families, rather than a romance between two people. Though the sagas are quite clear that affection and its absence mattered a great deal. Property was negotiated on both sides, and the terms were public and witnessed. Divorce, as we have seen, was available to both parties, and appears not to have been rare, and the property arrangements on divorce were laid out in law. And death was near, always. Infant mortality was high. A large proportion of children did not reach adulthood. Women died in childbirth. Accidents on the sea and the ice and in the hayfield took the strong. Wounds became infected. Famine came in bad years. And the skeletons tell the story of hard physical work from an early age, worn joints, heavy musculature, healed fractures. Teeth ground down and often, from the sugar-poor diet, in better condition than we might expect. A person of 50 was old, and a person of 70 was remarkable, and the old were valued for exactly the reason you would expect in a society without writing. They were the memory. They knew the law, the genealogies, the boundaries, the weather signs, the stories, the way to do the difficult things. In a house on a winter night, the oldest voice by the fire was, quite literally, the library. Before we follow them into the ground, let us ask what happened when a person in that house fell ill or was hurt. For it was a life with a great deal of injury in it, and no medicine to speak of. Healing was a household art, and largely a woman's one. There are repeated references in the sagas to women who were skilled at binding wounds, and one famous scene after a battle in which a woman tends the wounded in a barn, boiling a broth of leeks and herbs and giving it to a man with a belly wound, then smelling the wound afterward. If she can smell the leeks, the gut is pierced, and he will die, and she tells him so, and he takes the news calmly. Whether or not that particular test is sound, it shows a practical, observant, unillusioned approach to injury that runs right through the sources. The remedies were what the land offered: herbs, plants, animal fats, honey, which genuinely does inhibit infection, poultices, warmth, bindings, and the setting of broken bones, which the skeletons show they did, and often did well. Since a great many fractures in Viking Age burials have healed straight, there were surgical interventions of a rough kind: arrows drawn, wounds cleaned, limbs amputated, and some of the amputees survived and lived on, since the bone shows healing at the stump. And there were charms and runes and appeals to the gods alongside all of it, with no sense of contradiction whatever. You used the herbs, and you carved the runes, and you hoped. The steam bath was important, and in some regions it was a fixture of the farm, a small building where water was thrown on heated stones, used for cleaning and warming and treating aches, and clearly a social pleasure as well. In a cold, damp, hard-working life, it must have been one of the great reliefs available to anybody. What the bones tell us of that life is sobering and also rather impressive. Heavy labor from childhood shows in the joints and the muscle attachments. Backs and knees wore out. Teeth were generally sound, from a diet with almost no sugar, but ground down by the grit that came off the querns into the flour. And there are skulls with abscesses that must have caused appalling pain, with no possibility of relief. There are healed weapon injuries, skulls with sword cuts that closed and knitted, men who took a blade to the head and lived another 30 years. And there are the unhealed ones, which end the story where they are found. They lived, in short, with pain as a constant companion, and with almost no defense against serious illness. And they seem to have regarded this as simply the condition of being alive, which for almost all of human history it was. What comes off the sources is not complaint, but a rather bracing matter-of-factness, an expectation that things will hurt, that some will die, and that the household will go on doing what has to be done regardless. It is the same voice that produced the understated dialogue of the sagas, and it is one of the most distinctive things about them. And when a person died, what then? The burials of the Viking Age are extraordinarily varied, which tells us something in itself. There was no single orthodoxy, and practice differed by region and by century and by rank. Some were cremated, the body burned on a pyre, and the remains gathered under a mound. Some were buried whole. Some graves are simple pits with a knife and a brooch, and some are of a magnificence that stops the breath. For the great, there were the ship burials. A vessel would be dragged up from the water and set in a trench, and the dead laid in it, amid an astonishing accumulation of goods, and then the whole thing covered over with a mound of earth and turf. 2 such ships have come out of the ground in Norway in a state of preservation that borders on the miraculous, thanks to the blue clay that sealed them. And one of them contained 2 women, one older and one younger, buried with a ship, a wagon, sledges, beds, chests, looms and weaving tools, textiles, and elaborate carving over nearly every wooden surface, work of such quality that it changed what scholars believed about the art of the period. Who they were is unknown. The burial is clearly of the highest rank, and one of the women may have been a queen, and there is no way to be sure. The goods in the graves are the point. People were buried with what they would need, or with what expressed who they had been. A man with his weapons or his tools or his fishing gear. A woman with her brooches and beads and her keys and her weaving equipment. a farmer with a horse, a smith with his hammer and tongs. There are graves with cooking gear, with boats, with dogs, with hunting birds. This is a society that expected something to continue on the far side, though its ideas about what were plural and imprecise. A hall of the slain for those who fell in battle, a hall of the goddess for others, a shadowy realm below for those who died of sickness and age, and running through everything, and probably more important to most people day to day, a sense that the dead remain near the farm, in their mound, still involved, still to be respected, and capable of causing serious trouble if they were not. For the dead in these stories do not always stay put. Norse literature is full of the restless dead, the mound dweller who guards his treasure, the walking corpse who terrorizes the district, heavy and swollen and immensely strong, killing livestock and men until someone brave hauls him out of his grave and burns him, or strikes the head from him and burns that separately. The remedies are elaborate and specific, which suggests these fears were held seriously, and for a long time. And there is something very human in that. In a place with 4 months of darkness, where the dead lie in mounds in the home field 100 yards from the door, one can see how the boundary between the living household and the buried one might feel thin on a winter night. And there were sacrifices at the funerals of the great. And this is the darkest corner of the picture. An Arab diplomat traveling among the Scandinavian traders on the Volga in the 10th century has left us a long and appalling eyewitness account of the funeral of a chieftain, the ship, the goods, the drinking, and an enslaved girl who was, over the course of 10 days, ritually prepared and then killed and burned with her master. It is the single most detailed account we have of a Norse funeral, written by an outsider who was clearly both fascinated and horrified, and it stands as a corrective to any temptation to sentimentalize this world. The same society that produced the Combs and the poetry and the courts of law produced that, too. Let us now spend an ordinary day in the Longhouse, from waking to sleeping in the depth of winter, and simply live inside it for a while, with nothing to learn and nothing to work out, only the rhythm of it to rest within. It begins in darkness, because everything in midwinter begins in darkness. Somebody stirs the fire, and the banked embers, under their covering of ash, are uncovered and fed, and a small flame climbs, and the long room comes slowly out of the black, the curve of the roof timbers, the shapes of sleeping people along the benches, the frost on the inside of the doorframe. The air is cold above and warm below. Somebody goes out into the black morning to the byre, and comes back with the smell of the animals on them, and the door lets in a knife of freezing air, and is shut again quickly. Breakfast is porridge and sour milk, and perhaps a little dried fish, eaten from wooden bowls with horn or wooden spoons, sitting on the benches with the fire between. The talk is low and practical. The weather, the animals, what needs doing, who is coming, whether the ice will hold. Then the work. The beasts must be fed and watered and cleaned out, and this is the immovable daily labor of a northern winter, done by lamplight in the dark of a byre at both ends of the day. Hay is pitched down, water is fetched from the spring or melted from snow. Wood and peat are brought in and stacked, and then the indoor work begins in the light of the fire and the small oil lamps. The loom weights start their soft clicking. As the woman of the house passes the weft and beats it up, the drop spindles turn. A man works a piece of wood with a knife, shaping a bowl or a handle. Somebody twists rope. Somebody sharpens iron on a whetstone with that particular ringing rasp. Somebody works at the quern, and the grain grinds and grinds under the stone. There is a brief pale middle of the day, a couple of hours of thin gray light when the door might stand open for a while and outdoor jobs can be done. A repair to the turf wall. A trip for firewood. A look at the boat pulled up above the tide line and turned over and weighted with stones. Then it goes again, and by mid-afternoon it is night once more. The main meal comes in the evening, meat or fish, boiled in the cauldron over the fire or roasted at the edge of it, with porridge or flatbread, and ale, and it is eaten all together, Everyone on the benches, the master and mistress in the high seat, and the rest ranged down the hall, by standing, and the thralls at the far end nearest the bier. It is warm now, properly warm, the fire high, the room full of the smells of smoke and food, and wet wool, and animals, and people. And afterward, no one goes anywhere, because there is nowhere to go. The bowls are cleared. More wood on the fire. The hands find their work again, because hands are never quite idle. A child asks for a story and is told to wait, and then is told one anyway. Somebody sings. Somebody recites a poem he learned from his father. Two people set out a board game and the pieces click, and someone leans over to advise and is ignored. The talk goes around. The price of iron, the neighbor's boundary, the case that will come before the assembly in the summer, a marriage being considered. The man who never came back from Ireland, the weather in the year of the great winter, the story of the ancestor who came out to this valley and built the first house on this very spot, right here on the ground beneath these feet. And then the fire is banked, and the lamps are put out one by one, and the sheepskins are pulled up. And the household lies down along the benches in the warm dark, with the smell of wood smoke over everything, and the animals shifting quietly at the far end. And outside, beyond the thick turf walls, the wind goes over the roof, and the snow moves across the black fjord. And inside, in the deep of the house, 20 people breathe slowly together in the dark, and the embers glow and settle, and the long night passes over them. We should say something about the towns, for although this was overwhelmingly a rural world, the Viking Age also saw the first real urban places in Scandinavia, and they were remarkable. They grew up as trading centers at good harbors, a settlement on a Danish island, a town on a lake in Sweden, a busy port in Norway, a Norse foundation on an Irish river, and, in England, a great Scandinavian town on the site of a Roman city, whose waterlogged soil has preserved its streets and houses and workshops so completely that excavation there produced an almost absurd abundance of ordinary life, down to leather shoes, wooden bowls, textiles, insects, seeds, and the contents of latrines, which have told us in unwelcome detail about the intestinal parasites of the residents. These towns were small by any modern measure, perhaps a couple of thousand people at most, but they were genuinely urban, laid out in narrow plots running back from the street, packed with workshops, humming with specialized craft. Here were the comb makers working antler, the leather workers, the bead makers melting glass brought in from far away, the amber workers, the smiths, the moneyers striking the first Scandinavian coins. Here goods arrived from an astonishing range: silver from the Islamic Caliphate, silk from further east still, wine and glass and cornstones from the Rhineland, furs and walrus ivory from the far north, soapstone from Norway, and slaves from everywhere. And here, too, the ideas came in: coinage, urban law, new fashions, and eventually the new religion. Trade was conducted for much of the age not with coins as we use them, but by weight of silver, and the archaeology is full of the evidence: small folding balances and sets of graded weights that a merchant carried in a pouch, and hoards of what is called hack silver, which is exactly what it sounds like: coins and jewelry and ingots cut up into fragments to make up a required weight. A beautiful Islamic silver coin from Samarkand, and an arm ring from Ireland, and a bit of a chopped brooch might all sit in the same purse, valued not for their origin or their beauty, but purely for what the scales said. It is a very practical, very unsentimental way to handle money, and it tells you a good deal about the people who used it. There is one story of this age that deserves to be told on its own, because it is the purest example of what these people could do, and because we know it in more detail than almost any other act of settlement in the medieval world: the filling of Iceland. In the later 9th century, an island was found in the North Atlantic, 600 or 700 miles from Norway, entirely uninhabited but for a handful of Irish hermits who had rowed there in skin boats and who left when the newcomers arrived. It was a large island, green along its coasts and valleys, wooded then with birch scrub, full of grass and driftwood and seabirds and fish, and empty. And over the following 60 years or so, Families came out and took it, sailing across open ocean in cargo ships loaded with everything a farm requires: people, tools, timber, seed, and, remarkably, the livestock, cattle and sheep, and horses standing in the hold for a week of North Atlantic weather. They came for land. And because a strong king was consolidating power in Norway, and there were men who preferred not to be his subjects. And some came by way of Ireland and the Scottish Isles, bringing wives and enslaved people from those places. Which is why Icelandic ancestry to this day carries a strong Celtic component on the female side. Each family claimed as much land as it could take and use, built a longhouse and set to work. And what happened next is the interesting part. They built a society deliberately, from nothing in a generation, and they built it without a king. They divided the country into districts under chieftains whose authority was personal rather than territorial, so that a farmer could actually choose which chieftain to follow and could change his mind. They established the assembly and the law. They agreed a calendar. They argued about religion and settled it by a legal ruling. And then, when the age of settlement was over and the country was full, and there was nothing left to claim, they sat down through several centuries of long winters and wrote the whole thing down: who came, from where, with whom, and where each of them settled, farm by farm around the coast, in a book of settlements that names hundreds of the original claimants. There has never been anything else quite like it, an entire nation that knows, in detail, who its first inhabitants were, and where each of them chose to live, because the people themselves thought it worth recording. And out of that same impulse, and those same winters, came the sagas. And these towns are where the Viking world touched everyone else's most closely, and where you can see how connected it really was. A single grave in Sweden might contain objects from 4 or 5 distant regions. Coins minted in Central Asia turn up in Baltic Islands by the tens of thousands. A small bronze figure of the Buddha from northern India was found at that Swedish lake town. Everything moved, along the rivers and the coasts and the sea roads, in those shallow ships, carried by farmers who had gone out for a season and would go home in the autumn to cut the hay. And how did it end? Not with a battle, though there were battles, and not with a conquest, though the Scandinavian kingdoms fought and were fought over. The Viking Age ended, in the main, because the societies that made it changed from the inside, and the two great agents of that change were kingship and Christianity, and they arrived together and reinforced one another. Through the 10th and 11th centuries, the loose patchwork of chieftains and petty kings was consolidated, by force and by marriage and by attrition, into 3 organized kingdoms. Royal power grew, and with it taxation, coinage, royal towns, royal law, and a standing capacity to prevent independent adventurers from simply gathering a crew and sailing off to enrich themselves at the expense of the king's foreign policy. Raiding, which had been the enterprise of ambitious free men, became either royal warfare or piracy, and the space in between closed. And Christianity came, from England and from Germany, by missionaries and by trade, and above all by kings, who found in the new faith a powerful support for a new kind of authority. One God in heaven, one king on earth, an educated clergy who could write, and a place at the table of Christian Europe. Some kings converted and pressed conversion hard. In Iceland, in a moment that says everything about that society, the question of religion threatened to split the country at the assembly in the year 1000, and rather than fight, both sides agreed to submit the matter to the judgment of the law speaker, who was himself still a pagan. He lay down under a cloak for a day and a night, thinking, and then rose and delivered his ruling, that all should be baptized and the country should have one law, with certain private concessions to the old customs for a time. And that was that. A nation changed religion by a legal decision, arrived at by a man lying still under a blanket, in order to preserve the peace. The change was slower on the ground than in the law. Old practices persisted for generations. Quietly, in the countryside, hammer pendants and crosses were worn side by side. The old stories were told long after the old sacrifices stopped, which is precisely why they survived to be written down. But the direction was set. Churches were built. Tithes were levied. The dead were buried in churchyards without their goods, and the burning of ships and the killing of slaves at funerals ended. Writing came, and with it charters and records, and, in Iceland, that great flowering of literature which preserved the memory of the pagan centuries on parchment, made in a Christian country. By the later 11th century, the thing was over. There was no more of the old rating. The Scandinavian kingdoms had become ordinary members of medieval Christian Europe, quarrelsome and ambitious like everyone else, but operating by the same rules. And the far settlements followed their own arcs. Iceland endured, poorer and colder as the climate turned. Greenland's Norse colony held on for 450 years and then, in the 15th century, in worsening cold and isolation, faded out entirely, and no one knows in what order the last farms fell silent. And the little camp on the North American coast had been abandoned centuries before. An attempt that came to nothing, and was remembered only in two sagas that almost no one outside Iceland believed, until the site was found and dug in the 1960s. Exactly where the sagas implied it should be. What is left of it now? A great deal more than you might think, and much of it is closer to hand than you would expect. Start with the words. If you speak English, you speak a language that was seriously reshaped by Norse settlement, because the two languages were close enough to mingle rather than simply borrow. Take the ordinary unglamorous words: sky, egg, knife, window, husband, leg, skin, skirt, cake, gift, dirt, bag, law, take, get, give, call, want, die, happy, ugly, wrong, both, same and, most astonishing of all, the pronouns they, them and their, which English took from Norse, and which are about as intimate a piece of a language as exists. The word window is a small poem in itself. It comes from the Norse for wind-eye, the opening in the roof through which the smoke went out and the wind came in a house exactly like the one we have been sitting in tonight. Then the names. Across northern England and Scotland and the islands the map is thick with Norse. The endings that mean farm, and village, and valley, and clearing, and island, and headland. Whole regions carry the shape of Norse settlement in their place names, and so do the days of the week in English, 3 of which are named for Norse gods, and 1 for a Norse goddess, so that most of the English-speaking world invokes the old gods of the north 4 times a week without noticing. Then the physical remains, and they keep coming. The ships raised from the clay of Norwegian mounds, and the mud of a Danish fjord. The town beneath a modern English city. The turf house foundations that lie all over Iceland like the shadows of old houses in the grass. Sometimes with the ash and objects sealed beneath a datable layer of volcanic ash, which gives archaeologists a precision that most of the world's ancient sites can only envy. The hoards of hacksilver and Arabic coins turned up by farmers and by people with metal detectors. The runestones, thousands of them, standing in Swedish fields and Danish churchyards, raised by families for their dead, and carrying, in their carved lines, exactly the kind of information you would want. This person raised this stone for their father, who went east, or west, or south, and died in Greece, or in England, or in the land of the Saracens. They are memorials, and they are also the ordinary voices of the age, speaking directly, without a Christian chronicler in between. And there is the genetic and cultural inheritance across a startling arc of the world, in the islands north of Scotland, in Ireland's cities, in Normandy and from there into England, in the Baltic and along the Russian rivers, in Iceland, whose population still speaks a language close enough to the old tongue that school children can read the sagas in something near the original. But the deepest inheritance is the literature, and it is worth ending there. Because a group of farmers on a cold island at the edge of everything, in a country with no cities, no king and no army, spent their winters telling stories. And then, when writing came, wrote them down on calfskin in a language nobody else was using, out of nothing but the conviction that the memory was worth keeping. That is why we know the names of their gods, and the shape of their myths at all. when the parallel traditions of the rest of the Germanic world are almost entirely lost. Everything modern culture has made from that mythology, every retelling, every borrowing, every echo in later fantasy and opera and film, traces back to manuscripts written by a handful of Icelanders in the 13th and 14th centuries, working from what had been said aloud in longhouses through hundreds of winter nights. And now our long stay in the longhouse draws toward its close, and it is time to let it all come gently to rest, and to let yourself come to rest along with it. So let your mind begin to release the details now, the way you loosen your hold on the day's business as sleep draws near. Let the kings and the dates and the arguments blur softly together and drift away. You need hold on to none of it. Keep only, if you keep anything, the feeling of the place, the long low room, the fire down the middle, the smell of wood smoke, the click of the loom, the wind going over the roof. Let your thoughts go back, one last time, to where we began. You are on the bench, on the side nearest the fire. There is a sheepskin over your knees. The embers have settled into a long, low line of red and gold, and the light of them moves gently on the curved timbers overhead. And everything beyond that light is soft and dark. The loom weights have stopped clicking. The loom stands quiet against the gable. The old man has put down his carving. Somebody is still telling the story, quieter now. And not everyone is listening. And it does not matter, because there is no end to it, and there is all winter to fill. Somewhere at the far end of the house, a cow shifts and settles, and beyond the thick turf walls, out in the enormous dark, the snow is moving across the black water of the fjord, and it has nothing to do with you at all, because you are in here, where it is warm. And as you lie there, let this be the gentle thought that carries you down. All of those people are gone now. Every one, and they were as real as you are. They had cold hands and aching backs. They worried about the hay, and about a son who had not come home, and about whether the stores would last to spring. They lay down on those benches at the end of a long day exactly as you are lying down now, and pulled the wool up to their chins, and listened to the wind, and let the day go, and slept. And in the morning they got up, and did it all again, and that is how they got through, one winter at a time, for 300 years, on the edge of the habitable world. And they left behind, without meaning to, some of the words in your mouth and some of the names on your map, and 4 of the days of your week, and the stories that are still being told about them 1,000 years on, tonight, in the dark, to you. So perhaps you may set your own burdens down for tonight, as they set theirs down at the end of those long days. Nothing needs solving before you sleep. Nothing needs holding. The fire is banked. The animals are fed. The door is shut against the weather, and the house will keep. You have done enough today, more than enough, and the rest of it will still be there in the morning. And the morning will come, as it always does, as it came to them, slowly and grayly, and then with light. So, let your breathing slow now, and let it deepen, and let your body grow heavy and warm and still, sinking down into the quiet the way the fire sinks slowly into its own ashes at the end of a long night. There is nothing more to do. The house has been shown, and its people met, and their year followed from the cutting of the hay in the endless summer light to the deep dark of midwinter, and now it may all be gently let go. Let the last images grow soft and dim, and drift away into the warm dark. The long curved roof overhead, fading, the benches, and the shapes of people breathing along them. The loom against the wall, the chests, the hanging pots, the carved posts of the high seat, going quiet and indistinct as the light lowers. The line of embers down the middle of the house, dimming from gold to red to a deep sullen glow, and then to a few last sparks under gray ash. Let it all soften and recede. A warm place visited once, on a winter night, and now released, the way you release the day itself, as you sink toward sleep. There is nothing left to hold. There is nothing left to fear. There is only the quiet, and the warmth, and the slow soft tide of rest rising to carry you away. The wind goes over the roof, as it has gone over so many thousand roofs, on so many thousand nights. The snow moves across the dark water below. The turf walls hold the warmth in, patient and thick and living. And far above the smoke hole, over the fjord and the mountains and the whole cold and beautiful north, the winter stars are burning in a sky of extraordinary clarity. The same stars those farmers steered by across an ocean no one else had crossed, keeping their ancient watch over that house then, and keeping it now, over your house, over your room, over you. And you may rest now, as deeply and as peacefully as that old household, resting on its benches in the warm dark, carried down gently into the quiet and the rest that you have more than earned. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me here on Lanternlight Chronicles. If you are still awake, you may simply let these words fade and follow the story down into sleep whenever you are ready. And if ever you find yourself awake again on some other night, looking for something calm to carry you toward rest, I will be here, and there will be another long and gentle story waiting, another old house or vanished age to sit in together in the dark. Until then, from the warm bench and the low fire and the wind over the turf roof beneath the northern stars, I wish you nothing but stillness and comfort and peace. Rest now. Let everything be quiet. And I wish you a calm and peaceful night.